On the night of January 27th, 1986, a group of engineers in Utah were trying to stop a launch. They had the data, they had the analysis, they had a documented history of a known design flaw, and they had a teleconference with NASA that lasted for hours. They failed to stop the launch. The next morning, at 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Kennedy Space Center. 73 seconds later, it was gone. This is not a story about dissent being suppressed. That would be simpler. This is a story about dissent being present, documented, voiced, and on the record, and yet institutionally weightless. And that's a much harder problem, because it lets everyone individually off the hook, while the system walks toward a cliff. This is the 10th Man Podcast. Welcome back to the 10th Man Podcast. I'm Chris Porton. Last episode, we went to 1973, the Yom Kippur War, the Israeli intelligence failure, how Israel responded by building a mandatory dissenter into its intelligence architecture. The lesson there was about absence. There was no structural mechanism for opposition, and the consensus went unchallenged until it was catastrophically wrong. This episode is about presence, about what happens when the dissent exists, when the engineers speak, the memos are written, the concerns are on the record, and the system absorbs it all without changing trajectory. The Challenger disaster is one of the most studied organizational failures in modern history. The facts are documented in a presidential commission report, in congressional testimony, in declassified internal memos, and in the life's work of a Columbia University sociologist who spent years in the National Archives trying to understand exactly how it happened. What she found there changed the story, and it's the story this episode is about. To understand January 28th, 1986, you have to understand that the problem that happened that day, it wasn't a surprise. The space shuttle's solid rocket boosters, the two white cylinders that flanked the main orbiter, they were built by a Utah company called Morton Thiokol, where the cylindrical sections of each booster, where they joined together, these rubber seals are called O-rings, and they were supposed to prevent hot combustion gases from escaping during the launch. It was a critical joint, a criticality 1 item by NASA's classification system, meaning failure would result in loss of crew and vehicle. The O-rings had a known vulnerability. In cold temperatures, rubber loses its resilience and it stiffens. It takes longer to seat it against the joint. In the fraction of a second after ignition, that delay could allow hot gases to escape, a blow-by, which would erode the seal and potentially breach the booster entirely. This wasn't theoretical. It had been happening. In January 1985, a full year before Challenger, the Space Shuttle Discovery had launched on another cold morning. Post-flight inspection showed significant O-ring erosion and blow-by on the right solid rocket booster. It was the worst O-ring performance in the shuttle program to date. The flight had been conducted at 53 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest launch in shuttle history at that point. Roger Beaujolais was a Morton Thiokol engineer who specialized in these O-ring seals. He studied the Discovery data, and then, in July 1985, he wrote a memo to his company's vice president of engineering. The memo was unambiguous. Beaujolais described the O-ring problem as an existing and worsening risk. He wrote that without immediate corrective action, the company stood in jeopardy. And here I'm drawing from the documented memo of, quote, losing a flight along with the launch pad facilities. 6 months before Challenger, the Thiokol engineer had put the predicted outcome in writing. Loss of a flight, loss of human life. That memo was received, it was filed, and yet flights continued. NASA Level 1 management was briefed on the O-ring erosion problem on August 19, 1985. The program review concluded, officially, that it was safe to continue flying the existing design while a redesign was pursued. Nearly half of all shuttle flights, to that point, had shown some degree of O-ring erosion or blowby. The data was in the system. The risk had been assessed, and each flight that did not end in disaster was quietly treated as evidence that the risk was manageable. This is the mechanism that sociologist Diane Vaughan would later call the normalization of deviance. Not recklessness or corruption, something more insidious. An incremental drift in which a dangerous deviation from safety standards stops feeling dangerous because it's been survived repeatedly and therefore has been redefined as normal. The shuttle program flew. The O-rings eroded. Nothing catastrophic happened. And so the erosion became a known condition rather than a warning sign. The deviation had been normalized. On January 27, 1986, the night before the scheduled launch, the temperature at Cape Canaveral was forecast to drop to 18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. The predicted launch temperature the following morning was just 29 degrees. The coldest previous shuttle launch had been at 53 degrees Fahrenheit. No O-ring had ever been tested in any configuration at anywhere near 29 degrees. Alan McDonald, Morton Thiokol's director of the Solid Rocket Motor Project, was at Kennedy Space Center in person. He was alarmed. He called his engineers back in Utah. He asked them to prepare a formal presentation on the temperature effects on the boosters. A teleconference was scheduled for that evening. Engineers and managers from Kennedy Space Center in Florida, Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, and Morton Thiokol in Utah. Beaujolais and a colleague had only a few hours to assemble their charts. The Thiokol engineers presented for over an hour. The data showed the O-ring resilience problem very clearly. Their recommendation was explicit. Do not launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. At 29 degrees, they had no data. They were being asked to launch in a temperature range in which the seals had never been tested. Marshall Space Flight Center's Solid Rocket Booster Project Manager, Larry Malloy, he pushed back. He said the data was inconclusive. He challenged the engineers' logic. He pointed out that some of the worst O-ring performance in the data had occurred at warmer temperatures, a fact that was technically true, but that the engineers argued was a misreading of the overall pattern. The debate was heated. Malloy said something that has become one of the most quoted lines in the history of engineering ethics. Beaujolais recalled this NASA manager, mind you, saying, quote, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" NASA asked the Thiokol team to reconsider. And this is a critical moment. This is where the story turns. The Thiokol management team asked to go offline for a private caucus. The engineers were excluded from that meeting. Beaujolais and his colleague Arnie Thompson tried to present their data to the managers in the room, but they were rebuffed. Inside that room, Senior Thiokol VP Gerald Mason made clear that he was not persuaded by the engineering argument. He said, and this is documented in the Rogers Commission testimony, that a management decision was required. He reportedly turned to Bob Lund, Thiokol's vice president of engineering, the man with the engineering authority to sustain the no-go recommendation. Mason looked at Lund and said, "Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat." And Lund complied. The Thiokol managers came back on the teleconference having reversed their recommendation. The new position, the data was inconclusive, and launch was recommended. The engineers had no part in writing that new recommendation. Several refused to sign it. Alan McDonald, who was physically present at Kennedy with NASA management, was stunned when he heard the reversal. He appealed directly to NASA managers at the table not to launch, and he was overruled. NASA asked if there were any objections. Hearing none, because the people with objections had been removed from the decision, NASA gave the go. It was the first time in the shuttle program's history that NASA had launched after receiving an explicit no-go recommendation from a prime contractor. Historians have noted that The sharp pressure to reverse the no-go stands in stark contrast to the unquestioning acceptance when the recommendation was changed to go. That asymmetry is important. One direction faced friction and the other did not. The next morning, Beaujolais watched the launch from a monitor at Morton Thiokol in Utah. He'd predicted the O-ring would fail before liftoff. When the shuttle cleared the launch tower without exploding, he felt a brief relief. 73 seconds later, he watched the shuttle disintegrate. President Reagan formed the Rogers Commission 6 days after the disaster. Its members included Neil Armstrong, Sally Ride, Chuck Yeager, and, crucially, the physicist Richard Feynman. The commission's findings were damning. It determined the cause of the accident was exactly what Beaujolais had predicted. Hot gas blew past the O-rings in the right solid rocket booster, breached the external fuel tank, and destroyed the vehicle. The Rogers Commission concluded the accident was, quote, rooted in history. Meaning, the O-ring problem had been known, documented, and accepted as tolerable for years before it became fatal. It identified the decision-making process as seriously flawed. It criticized Marshall Space Flight Center for management isolation, a tendency to keep safety concerns internal rather than elevating them. It criticized NASA's overall safety culture and its overambitious launch schedule, which had created relentless institutional pressure to fly. Roger Beaujolais testified before the commission. He described the teleconference caucus as, in his exact words, an unethical decision-making forum resulting from intense customer intimidation. The commission published its report on June 6, 1986, with 9 recommendations for reform. NASA accepted all of them. The solid rocket boosters were redesigned. A new Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance was created, reporting directly to the NASA administrator. The launch rate was reduced. Procedures were changed. By most institutional standards, the response was thorough. There is a layer of this story that many people don't know. Richard Feynman was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and by his own description, something of an institutional troublemaker. He approached the Rogers Commission the way he approached every problem, by going directly to the source, talking to engineers, not administrators, and following the data wherever it led. What he found disturbed him deeply. The most striking discrepancy he uncovered was between NASA's official risk estimates for shuttle failure and what the engineers who built the shuttle actually believed. NASA management had publicly stated that the probability of catastrophic shuttle failure was approximately 1 in 100,000. Feynman canvassed engineers independently. Their private estimates ranged from 1 in 100 to as low as 1 in 50. That gap between what the institution said and what the people inside that institution believed was, to Feynman, the central fact of the disaster. NASA had created a culture in which the official risk assessment had become detached from the engineering reality. The engineers knew the risk was far higher than the officially reported numbers. The official number existed for political and budget reasons, and the gap between them had never been formally confronted. Feynman's fellow commissioners reached their conclusions and almost universally finished their criticisms of NASA with recommendations that the agency address the problems internally, no suspension of operations, no reduction in funding, and Feynman believed this was totally wrong. He thought NASA, as currently structured, should not continue flying without a fundamental overhaul. He even threatened to remove his name from the commission's final report. Feynman was the dissenter on the commission investigating the disaster caused by dissent being ignored. The structure repeated itself, a majority consensus, and one voice insisting the consensus was wrong, but only being accommodated at the margins. After much internal pressure, Feynman's minority findings were eventually published as Appendix F of the Rogers Commission report. It is one of the most direct and readable documents in the history of institutional criticism. It ends with a line that has been quoted in engineering ethics courses ever since. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. So here's where the story gets more complicated, and probably even more important. The Rogers Commission told a villain story. Schedule pressure, management overriding engineers, a culture of production overriding a culture of safety. It was a story with identifiable bad actors making identifiable bad decisions. Diane Vaughan, a sociologist then at Boston College, set out to document that story. She spent years in the National Archives reviewing the primary source material, the internal memos, the meeting transcripts, the engineering reviews, the actual decision-making record going back years before the disaster. And she found something different. She later told Columbia magazine, quote, "This appeared to be a typical case of misconduct. There were production pressures and violations, and NASA was continuing to fly despite knowing about the flaws in the system. Based on the Commission's report, it looked like you had amoral, calculating managers who threw caution to the wind. But when I went to the National Archives, I found something completely different." What she found was that the managers weren't calculating risk against schedule. They were genuinely, within their own framework, operating by the rules as they understood them. The O-ring erosion had been reviewed. It had been assessed. It had been survived. Each survival had incrementally shifted the baseline of what was considered acceptable. This was the normalization of deviance. Not a single bad decision, an incremental drift over the course of years in which a dangerous deviation from safety standards stopped feeling like a deviation because it kept being survived. The engineers raised the alarm, but they had raised alarms before, and nothing catastrophic had happened. And so the alarm over time carried less weight because the accumulated experience of not dying had slowly redefined the signal as noise. Vaughan's conclusion was stark. She said the Challenger disaster was an accident, the result of a mistake. What is important to remember is not that individuals in organizations make mistakes, but that mistakes themselves are socially organized and systematically produced. So the villain story that we heard from the Rogers Commission, in a way, it lets institutions off the hook. Fire the bad managers, redesign the O-ring, change the procedures, and move on. Vaughan's version is harder to resolve because it isn't about bad people. It's about the structure that turns good people's judgment into drift. So what actually made the dissent weightless? Several forces, documented across the Rogers Commission findings, Feynman's appendix, and Vaughan's research. They don't belong to 1986. They belong to any organization where high stakes and accumulated experience have had time to work on each other. There's the normalization of prior near misses. Every shuttle flight that returned with O-ring erosion but without catastrophe was quietly filed as evidence that the risk was tolerable. The engineers saw a trend that was getting worse, but the institution saw a pattern of survival. Same data, opposite conclusions. The difference was the framework being used to interpret it. Then there was the burden of proof and its inversion. On the night of January 27th, the engineers were asked to prove that it was unsafe to launch. The normal logic of safety engineering, that the burden of proof should fall on those who want to proceed, had been reversed. Beaujolais later said he couldn't quantify his concerns precisely enough to satisfy the standard that was being applied. He knew the risk was real. He couldn't prove it numerically to management's satisfaction. And that inversion of the burden of proof made the dissent structurally unanswerable, because certainty about a future failure is always impossible before the fact. And then we have the removal of engineers from the decision. That caucus was the mechanism And by taking the decision off the teleconference line and into a management-only back room, the engineers weren't overruled, they were removed entirely. The final recommendation came from management. The engineers who disagreed were not part of the recommendation. Their dissent was technically still on the record from the teleconference, but it wasn't part of the decision. There's a difference between dissent being heard and dissent being present in the room where the decision is made. Then there's the customer relationship. Morton Thiokol's contract with NASA was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. NASA was their primary customer. So when NASA pushed back on the no-go recommendation with visible frustration, Thiokol managers faced a choice between sustaining the engineering position and accommodating their biggest customer. The Rogers Commission noted that Thiokol withdrew its objections to, quote, accommodate a major customer. That language is precise. The dissent wasn't defeated by argument and reason. It was withdrawn under commercial pressure. Then there was the success trap, again. The shuttle program had flown 24 successful missions. It had built a reputation for operational reliability and excellence. That reputation had institutional value for NASA's budget, for its standing with Congress, for the promise it had made to the country that space could be made routine. Prior success created pressure to keep succeeding. And it created a baseline of expected safety that made the engineers' concerns sound like excessive caution rather than accurate warning. Change the industry, change the decade, this structure stays the same. 17 years after Challenger, on February 1st, 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry. All 7 crew members were killed. The cause was different. A piece of foam insulation from the external fuel tank had broken off during launch and struck the leading edge of the orbiter's left wing. The damage compromised the thermal protection system of the shuttle, so during re-entry, superheated air entered the wing and tore the vehicle apart. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board, the CAIB, conducted the post-disaster analysis. Its conclusion about NASA's organizational culture was direct and pretty devastating. The institutional practices present at the time of Challenger, inadequate concern over deviations, schedule pressure, a safety program without real authority, these things had all returned. The CAIB drew a straight line between 1986 to 2003. The foam strike problem had been observed on multiple previous shuttle flights. It had been assessed as a maintenance issue rather than a safety of flight issue. Thus, it had been survived. And so it had been normalized. The CAIB's formal finding was unambiguous. Quote, the causes of the institutional failure responsible for Challenger have not been fixed. Diane Vaughan was asked to serve on the Columbia Investigation Board. After the report was released, she attended a NASA luncheon in Washington. She was seated at a table, uncertain of how she would be received. Not everyone at NASA had welcomed her Challenger analysis exactly. A woman approached her and reportedly broke into tears. She said, I can't believe we did this again. 17 years, 2 commissions, hundreds of recommendations, and the same failure mode with different hardware, killing another 7 people. The Yom Kippur story was about a system with no descent mechanism. The solution, in theory, was to build one. The Challenger story is about what can happen even after you build one. The engineers objected. The memos were written. The no-go recommendation was on the record clearly. And it didn't matter, because the dissent had no structural weight behind it. It could be removed from the room. It could be dropped from the call. It could be reversed under commercial pressure. And it could be gradually eroded by the accumulated experience of surviving what should have been warning signs all along. The lesson Diane Vaughan drew from 17 years of studying the Challenger disaster is worth sitting with. The problem wasn't that individuals made bad choices. It was that the system was organized to produce those choices. The normalization of deviance is not a character flaw. It's what organizations do, systematically and predictably, when the feedback loop between risk and consequence is slow enough that survival keeps getting misread as safety. Roger Beaujolais spent the rest of his life giving lectures on engineering ethics and organizational behavior. He delivered more than 300 of them before his death in 2012. He never stopped believing that he had failed, even though he had done everything a dissenter could do within the structure he was given. And that's the point. He did everything right. It was the structure that was wrong. A paraphrase of Richard Feynman's line from Appendix is essentially the thesis of this show when applied to organizations. Reality must take precedence over internal consensus, because reality cannot be fooled. The question the Challenger disaster forces is not, how do we find braver engineers who will speak up? The engineers were already brave. They did speak up. The question is, how do we build systems where the dissenting voice is not just present, but structurally impossible to remove from the room in which the decision is made? In our next episode, Medicine. How the randomized control trial was invented because a doctor's own judgment, even brilliant, experienced, well-meaning judgment, kept killing patients. The history of evidence-based medicine is the history of a field building institutionalized distrust of itself into its own methodology. Thanks for listening to The 10th Man.